I had no idea my wife was so conceited, narcissistic, and delusional. She managed to elevate her infidelity to a virtue in her mind. These were her words, and they kept repeating in my head as I dealt with the unfathomable truth of betrayal. She was breathing heavily and passionately during the intense confrontation. Her face and chest were red, her eyes were burning, and she gave me a challenge that made me give up. This narrative tells the tale of a journey filled with love, betrayal, and the pursuit of truth amid the ruins of everything I once thought was ideal. See the illusions disintegrate. Does the wife think that loving more than one person at once is okay? The plot of today's article is comparable. Have fun with it. On that cold, gray November day in Chicago, I was standing in a deserted lot looking out over the surrounding landscape. I could see soot-covered walls, broken glass shards, and trash that the relentless wind had flung across the plot. This scene struck me as a metaphor for my life, a burned-out, empty shell that was rife with hatred and loneliness. I was thinking about what to do next as I stood there when I noticed Jessica, who I had met a few weeks earlier at a charity function. Seth, my cousin, invited me to this event and recommended that I take advantage of it to broaden my business network. Even though the evening was uneventful, Jessica's poise and assurance drew my attention. We had a great conversation all evening, and I made the decision to ask her to dinner. We had a lot in common when we met, and I quickly warmed up to her. We dated for a few months until our feelings for each other waned. One evening, Jessica took the initiative despite my hesitancy and doubts, proving that desire is not just a man's domain. I was so tired by the end of the ride that she could have started a mechanical bull racing team. I had never had so much fun doing something myself. Intimacy in our relationship became easier and more frequent after that. After only a few months of meeting, we were living together, and a little more than a year later, we were married. We got a dog, did some landscaping, moved into a 4-bedroom house in a lovely neighborhood full of trees, and life was wonderful. I was unwilling to accept that my loneliness would end. I received unwavering emotional support, meaningful sex gave me physical fulfillment, and having someone to love and adore was everything and more that I had always wanted in a spouse. Naturally, there were a few problems. Jessica was annoyed by my availability because I was usually a little busy at work, and she probably didn't like a few other behaviors as well. Of course, I was enraged too. The fact that we had to spend a lot more time with her family than I would have preferred was probably the hardest obstacle. Please understand that I didn't hate her family. They were decent, good people with a generally polite manner and no particularly unpleasant personality traits, but I didn't want to spend a lot of time with them. Her parents were a happy, outgoing couple who seemed to like me, but they also gave us life advice and heavily pushed for us to get married. It wasn't a huge deal, though, because we never spent enough time together for it to annoy me. I found her younger sister Mindy and her husband a little more challenging. Jessica's shorter, somewhat rounder counterpart was Mindy. When Jessica was around, she never left her side for longer than a few minutes, and she behaved and dressed like Jessica. They were openly gossiping about friends and family, laughing at inside jokes, and conversing conspiratorially, virtually, like Siamese twins. We also spent a lot of time together because she and her husband lived 15 minutes away from us. That's okay, I believe, maybe it was jealousy, but it was really awkward because she wasn't really with me when she was with Mindy. Things did not get better with Mindy's husband around. Mark was a tall, handsome, fair-haired man who was easygoing, amiable, and not very smart, in my opinion. Once he assumed ownership of his family's Joliet furniture store, it became his favorite and sometimes the only topic of conversation. He boasted about how well-run the store was and how no one else in the furniture industry knew what they were doing, talking about it as if it were Microsoft and he was Bill Gates. The problem with this perspective was that the store was having problems, and I was sure that any businessperson worth their salt would see Mark as a contributing factor. But I wanted Jessica to have peace and happiness, and part of that meant not causing trouble for her family, so I nodded a lot during more than one evening. Normally, I would have let Mark finish. Jessica had asked me to help Mindy and Mark when we were almost 2 years married. She was dressed for a night in bed that promised relaxation, and she had prepared a delicious dinner complete with candles and music to set the mood. Like any other newlywed, I therefore assumed that her only goal in being here with me was to play a fantastic role. But as the evening wore on, it was clear she had other ideas. She went on to say that we were lucky to have such a big salary and that we were in a great position to help other people. She then expressed her worry about Mindy and Mark's financial stability with a look of pragmatic sadness. It came to light that Mark was struggling to make his payments on a certain amount of debt. He would not be able to finish his inventory list on his own. I saw where this was going from the start and got to work. She paused and raised her eyebrows, signaling that I had misinterpreted her planned presentation. "Live, how much do they need?" she asked. She bit her lip, thought for a second, and then timidly met my eyes. "He needs either $50,000 or $60,000. This will give them freedom and confidence." I was about to choke. Yes, we were doing well, but that amount would have taken a big bite out of our available funds, and the majority of my money was held in a family trust. Bernie Blackman, our chief business attorney and trust administrator, didn't need to know that I could take the money out of the trust if I really needed it. He would comply with my request, but I knew he would be fighting with me to recoup the money for some time to come. He simply took his duty to safeguard the trust funds and the company very seriously. He wasn't a cruel man. When I gave it some thought, it was the only occasion in our marriage that I tried to brush off Jessica's earnest request. She scowled and said, "I don't know, Liv, that's a lot of money." Mimi claims he has some amazing ideas and that they would repay the money straight away. If money is your main concern, they make a nice living, I'm certain of it. I wasn't sure about that. To be honest, I was positive that sending it to Mark would cause a significant financial loss. However, I wanted Jessica to be happy, so I wrote out a $60,000 check and told her that we would need to make some small financial sacrifices until the money was returned. It was once said that if you lend money to a relative, you should assume you won't see them again. This helps you get emotionally ready in case they don't return the money, which won't hurt your relationship. According to my understanding, it was a gift, a $60,000 gift to Jessica's sister and her somewhat incompetent brother-in-law. Since I knew he wasn't a competent businessman to operate his own store, I didn't think this would solve the issue. I was miserable even with money, but I still wanted to be a good man for her and her family. I was prepared to spend $60,000 in order to win their approval. I was at home searching for a flash drive containing important data 3 or 4 months after I had lent Mark the money. My bad habit of leaving important things in strange places almost led to me stealing the entire house. I went into the guest room and looked under the bed and around the table after going through all the usual places. When I got up, I noticed that there was a lot more chaos than I could find with my quick search, and that it was unusually lumpy, at least by Jessica's standards. It was obvious that someone had been lying in it, and without properly prepping it, they had quickly pulled up the sheets and blankets. I didn't think it was a big deal at the time, but I accidentally brought it up to Jessica later that night. "Hey, did anyone sleep in the guest bed?" "I went there lately, and it was somewhat unkempt," I replied. Jessica looked uncomfortable and hot, stuttering through her response. There was a time in our marriage when I trusted Jessica so completely that I couldn't imagine her explanation being anything other than God's honest truth. "Well, I had a nap there earlier." "Sorry, I was cleaning and was so exhausted that I immediately hopped into bed with no time to clean anything." To be honest, I thought it was funny that she was afraid or ashamed that she had to nap in the middle of the day and that the blanket wasn't the only hint I missed. Over the course of the following year or two, a string of strange, inexplicable incidents happened that would have demonstrated Jessica's lack of morality if I hadn't stuck my head so far up my ass. She worked as an assistant manager at a small independent bookshop, for example, and I took it for granted that she was required to attend a 5 or 6 hour meeting every Tuesday. The meeting was so important that I shouldn't have tried to get in touch with her at the time. I was open to any explanation for the small bruises that started to show up on her body, even though some of them were in rather intimate places and might have been caused by her undies, which I couldn't remember her wearing. And then there was the orange juice story. Jessica started shopping at a brand new, upscale supermarket, which was okay, until she realized that many of the products they wanted, including my preferred brand of orange juice, were not available. She countered that the new store was better and more convenient for her because it was right on her route home from Tuesday meetings, despite my objections and advice to change stores. Her grocery shopping habits might not seem like a big clue that she was cheating, but knowing that was what made me finally take a moment to think things through and came to the realization that broke my heart. Jessica alluded to the fact that Mark and Mindy would need more money less than 18 months after the initial loan. He hadn't even reimbursed half of the initial $60,000 by then, and I wasn't about to part with any more cash, especially for an endeavor I thought was unsustainable. I turned down Jessica's offer in the hopes that she would understand and quit nagging, but she insisted on telling Mindy and Mark that they might lose business if they didn't make improvements and purchase more merchandise. I finally agreed to see Mark's business plan and take a tour of the store to see what he intended to do, since I was still trying to be Mr. Popular and couldn't say no in public. If I could show Jessica that this was a poor investment, I was hoping she would back off. On Monday morning, I met Mark at his place of business. He gave me a tour, showed me the layout of the space, introduced me to the employees, smiled, and gave me a pat on the back as though we were old friends. When we paused to chat with someone, he confided in us almost too much when discussing his business plan, saying he thought the store would make a healthy profit right away if he had a little extra cash to expand inventory and do some renovations. We spent 30 minutes in Mark's office, during which I tried my best to be sensitive in my concerns. I informed him that I believed the company was facing some significant issues. Even with the improvements he intended to make, I hinted that he was unlikely to grow client interest and revenue until he could optimize and reduce expenses and pricing. I went so far as to suggest that he sell the company and look for other employment opportunities, but he was offended and said that everything could be fixed with a cosmetic procedure. I told him that I wouldn't have enough money on my own to give him a sizable loan and that it would need to come from a trust because I didn't want to break my heart to deny him. I told him that although I couldn't promise anything, I would go back and talk to Bernie to see if he could make the loan possible. My plan was to avoid as much controversy as possible and give the impression that I was genuinely trying to get him money before breaking the bad news and holding Bernie accountable for turning him down. I knew it was cowardly, but I didn't want to lose so much money and I wanted to keep the peace in the family. Actually, Bernie would pretty much do anything I asked of him, but I was always very clear in telling everyone I knew that he had to exercise strict control over the trust and that I was powerless to overrule his decisions. Making Bernie the bad guy may seem unfair, but in all honesty, I think he enjoyed his work and never once complained to me about it. When the conversation came to an end, Mark confidently smiled and nodded, expressing his belief that he would be given credit. He gave me a firm handshake and gave me another back rub, which made me feel even worse as I turned to leave. I thought about meeting Mark and trying to absolve myself of the transgressions of timidity and almost dishonesty that I had committed in his business as I drove out of the parking lot and down the highway. As I drove along, not really looking around, I noticed something that at first seemed like a strange coincidence but eventually developed into a vague and unsettling thought. Compared to most larger chains, it was a smaller grocery store with a giant Salvador sign and a green paint job. I was positive that I had never seen anything like it before because of how bizarre it looked, but I couldn't place the memory associated with the name. It took me a few minutes to realize that the store was called Salvador after giving it some thought. Jessica started going to a different grocery store, which was closer to our house and didn't carry my favorite orange juice. Still, it wasn't close to her job or any other place where it made sense for her to spend her weekdays. Therefore, unless she was doing her Tuesday activities inside a furniture store, it didn't make sense that this store was convenient for her. When I gave it some thought, some unpleasant possibilities came to mind. I turned around, drove past Salvador's, and went back to Mark's furniture store to spend a short while sitting in his parking lot. After pulling out my phone to see if this was the only Salvador store in Chicago, I thought about all the possible reasons she might shop there for 15 or 20 minutes. I considered the possibilities that Jessica worked from a different office in the neighborhood, that she would meet Mindy for lunch at work, or that she frequently visited a nearby medical facility. But my thoughts kept bringing me back to a conclusion that I didn't want to confront. I had an overwhelming urge to find out more information and speak with Mark face to face. I quickly exited the vehicle and made my way to the front door of the furniture store, where I saw that, except on Tuesdays, when it closed at noon, the store was open until late on weekdays. The suspicion cancer that had surfaced moments earlier was still growing. I slammed the door, went inside, and went up to the first person I saw, a clumsy middle-aged man making coffee. He abruptly stopped and said angrily, "I'm going to take a break right now." I apologize. I looked at him expectantly and said, "I don't want to take up your time, but I have an urgent need to speak with Mark McCloy. I've discussed some serious financial difficulties with him and need additional information." But instead of listening to my demands, he continued to stir his coffee and even took a sip. "This is quite crucial. Could you please phone him for me?" I repeated, this time with a more urgent tone, after realizing that one of the reasons they couldn't promote the product had become apparent. "You are the person who was here earlier with Mark, correct?" he asked after giving me a strange look for a moment. He led me carefully back into the room, leaving me with the TV remote and a cup of coffee. "Yes, come in. Mark is currently meeting with the supplier, but you can wait for him in the break room if you choose. I don't think he'll stay around for long, maybe a half hour maximum." I'd hurriedly come up with a plan that involved going straight after Mark and pulling a few fast one-ups about how I had concrete proof that he and Jessica were having an affair. I would threaten to let Mindy and the rest of the family know about the evidence if he didn't confess right away. I made up my mind that if Mark cheated on her, he would leave right away, and if not, I would have to deal with the shame. I thought maybe I would make a joke out of it or something. I was moving around the room mentally practicing my speech, thinking about how I would suggest that I had pictures or footage, or even say that Jessica had confessed. I looked around the room, mindless, because I was thinking about the impending confrontation. I spent a lot of time reading magazines and watching TV before deciding to search the area for hints. I finally realized that if they were taking advantage of the company to con people, they were probably using this break room, and if they were probably using the old couch I had been glancing at for a few minutes. I looked at the sofa with fear and resentment. It was faded green in color, with a few stains from coffee and a rip in the fabric. It was clear that one of the armrests had seen better days. It would look much better in a junkyard or used goods store. When I raised the cushion, my heartbeat became a little faster. It was a full-sized bed with linens on it, as I could see. Before I moved the bed, I made sure Mark was still in his office. There were a few slightly darker yellowed patches where a wet spot from sex would be expected, and the linens were wrinkled and soiled. The bed seemed to have one or two lipstick smears on it, and the room had a strong perfume odor. I pulled up each item one at a time as I stretched my right hand into the space above the bed to reach the dirty carpet below after opening the bed and noticing some debris on the floor beneath the sofa. Finally, I found a pen, 37 cents, and traded in an empty Kegel tube, a broken coffee cup, and a restaurant receipt. Jessica was partial to a Mexican restaurant, and her signature style of smoothness, elegance, and incriminating style characterized the check. Finding the check made me feel lighter, even though, in retrospect, I realized it was really flimsy circumstantial evidence that could easily be explained away by a variety of tales or explanations. My last thought painted a clear picture of a cheating wife and a shady brother-in-law, along with the minor annoyances of her Tuesday appointment schedule, bruises, the use of underwear, and the mess in her bed. My plan to scare Mark into confessing didn't seem like a good idea. I was looking for unambiguous proof of betrayal, and I knew that a confrontation could ruin everything or make it difficult to prove. But now that I knew where and when the betrayal was most likely to happen, I could probably find the information I needed. I felt my heart race as I clenched my teeth and sat down on the sofa after folding the bed. Although I've been conned in a few business deals and remember being conned at cards once, I've never felt betrayed in my life like this. I was going to yell, cry, pound the wall, and shout all at once. But out of this internal maelstrom, one intense urge surfaced, the need to exact revenge. After gaining some composure, I tried to think about my circumstances as objectively and emotionally as I could. When I had hard proof, I thought about Mark and my wife's weaknesses and how I could take advantage of them to feed my wounded pride. My first thought was to beat the living hell out of Mark, but I took that as a warning to go to jail. My second thought was to back out of the loan and demand an immediate return of all outstanding funds, but then I recalled Bernie's advice from back when I was trying to borrow money from a particularly aggressive bank. He advised against it, saying that you are in their hands if you owe someone money, especially if that person isn't considering your best interests. My desire was to grab Mark by the balls. Glancing back into Mark's office, I saw him get up and give the supplier a handshake. I smiled and waved. After giving the supplier a wave in return, he hurried back to the break room. I grinned and shook my head, saying, "Hey John, did you forget anything? You need more information?" "Listen, Mark, I thought about it, and I believe I may have made the wrong impression today. I hope you understand. I think you're a fantastic businessman, and I believe you have a real chance to succeed with the store. However, as I was leaving, I realized that I may have misunderstood when I inquired about your plans in case things did not go as planned." He grinned in return. "No, John, I've got it. A good businessman asks uncomfortable questions." Great. I just wanted to let you know that I really enjoy what you're doing here. Besides, you're a family member, and I have to believe this isn't simply a slick investment. It is the best move you can make as a friend, family member, and businessman. So, I didn't want you to go home without knowing that. I was going to work hard to obtain this money for you. I can't imagine we won't get it. As previously said, I do not have a large amount of money in my own accounts, so I must request a trust fund withdrawal. But honestly, I believe I can persuade Bernie to give in, and we will collect the money for you." Mark listened, a wide smile spreading across his face as I said the words. "Man, that sounds fantastic. I'm telling you, this business is about to take off, so this loan is equally safe with me as it is with the bank. You have absolutely no need to be concerned. I am not worried at all. Naturally, Bernie will need to come to an agreement because he is adamant about protecting the trust through collateral and other means. I can have everything signed in a few days if that's all right with you. I think you'll get the money in about a week." After locking the door and settling into a chair, I went into Bernie's office the next morning. He was taking notes, talking on the phone, and raising one finger to show that he would soon be able to speak. I was twitching visibly as he ended the call, and he seemed to notice because he looked at me shocked and said, "So, John, what made you so nervous this morning?" "Yes, I think this should not be an issue. What kind of loan and how much?" I said, clearing my throat and leaning forward slightly to speak. "Bernie, I believe I'll need access to a trust to obtain a substantial loan." He turned on the computer with his mouse and clicked a few icons to launch a spreadsheet that detailed the information about the trust fund. I leaned in closer, clearing my throat once more. "Look, Bernie, before we begin filling out the paperwork, the first thing I need from you is complete confidentiality. I always know, listen, I want you to understand that this is rare and it may be tempting to speak with coworkers or family members. I don't want anyone except you and me to comprehend what I'm trying to do here." He shifted in his seat, furrowed his brow, and then, after a moment, started talking. "John, if this is illegal..." He shook his head, so I went on. "It is not illegal, not at all. What I actually want you to do is create a document that represents the peak of sound legality. I'd like to borrow some money and have you draw out loan documentation. I want the loan terms to be absolutely explicit. I want the loan to be appropriately collateralized by the firm for which I intend to grant it, and the penalty for non-payment to be very clearly defined. It sounds like you are expecting a default. It's almost as if you want to draw the guy into a trap. So, who are you trying to trap and why?" I gave it some thought before answering, then met his eyes directly. He raised his eyebrows in surprise and repeatedly opened his mouth to reply, but he never said anything. "I intend to capture my brother-in-law, Mark. The reason is Jessica." At last, he took a sip from a glass of water on the table and questioned, "Are you sure about this?" with anxiety. "Very," I answered. After a week, The paper was ready, and I gave it to Mark in person so he could review and sign it. He asked to come down and go over the document with his lawyer, a small but strong banking guy who also happened to be his cousin. "All right, sir," I said. "Tim, I looked at it last night, and it pretty much matches my expectations for a company loan, but Mark, there are a few things I'd like to point out before you sign, okay?" Mark smiled politely, as usual. "Sure, give me the details." Tim cleared his throat, then fixed his intense gaze on Mark. I thought I saw disdain in his eyes, as though he realized how little business management Mark knew. "Okay, first thing, the $425,000 loan will be repaid over 7 years. You've got a fairly standard rate here. Payments will begin immediately, totaling a little more than $6,000 per month." Mark gave a nod. "The real amount you will receive will be only $365,000 because we are combining it with your loan from a few years ago. John will receive $60,000, and you will receive the remainder. Is it clear?" Mark smirked and said, "I see," in a tinier Italian. Tim gave him another glance before speaking softly. "Okay, now the loan is secured by collateral. It is related to both your business and the property above Kayak. Is this where they hunt ducks?" "Yes," Mark said to Bernie as he talked to Tim. "They wish to protect Junk Trust in the event that the business fails." He hesitated for a moment before quickly adding, "But that will not happen. The business is in terrific shape, I believe so, and Bernie Black seemed to think so." He gave me a nod and a smile, and John absolutely believed so. "Seriously, John?" "Yes," I said, trying to sound as enthusiastic as I could. "Mark showed me the books, and I believe he has a winner here." I laughed. "Though I'm not sure if you know, Bernie, but he's quite conservative and constantly analyzes the worst-case situation. He wants to be certain that the trust is protected, so it is critical to him that if the business collapses for some inexplicable cause, there is something to recompense the trust." Tim scowled and fixed his gaze on Mark. "Do you understand that if you default, you risk losing the business transferred to the trust as well as the land for duck hunting? This has been in our family for a very long time." Mark said in a sincere tone, "Certainly, perhaps to show Tim that he understood and took the warning seriously. I understand the consequences, still would, but to be honest, I am quite confident in the business, and I believe that taking out this loan is far safer than trying to run it without it. Do you understand that fines start accruing 3 months after an insufficient payment, right?" He grinned at me and said, "I fully understand," as though we were sharing a secret, and he knew that I would never allow Bernie to impose harsh fines on anyone for anything save the most horrible transgressions. I just gave him a smile in return. Jessica was ecstatic. She went on and on about how now that Mark had enough money to deal with his major problems, his business would succeed. I managed, for some reason, to avoid saying what I really wanted to say, which was that money could not solve Mark's main problem. But the easiest thing I could do around Jessica for the next 2 weeks was to keep quiet about Mark's commercial potential. It would take time to get the information I needed to end my marriage the way I wanted to, so I knew I would have to learn to control my emotions, which ranged from sadness to anger and disgust at her deceit. It became difficult to eat dinner with her without breaking out, and sex was avoided at all costs. And I was forced to rely on recollections of a fairly unpleasant sexual experience from many years ago, since I had no doubt. My friends and I went to San Diego for spring break when I was 18. To relax, we stayed one night in Tijuana. We watched some incredibly graphic and, to be honest, heartbreaking sex shows, drank, and left with a few. Somehow, I was paired with a 30-something woman who had clearly experienced a challenging upbringing. She was not particularly attractive, and she might have been even less attractive than I remember, considering how clearly a high blood alcohol content affected my assessment of aesthetic attractiveness. Even in this condition, I started making excuses to avoid putting her to bed because I felt very uncomfortable doing so. But I felt like I had no choice because my friends were harassing me and making fun of my manhood, my sexual orientation, and everything else. I drank a few more drinks, gritted my teeth, and hurriedly pretended to smile before following her into the dingy, dirty private room above the bar to start working. I now realized that in order to finish the task at hand, I would have to act as though she didn't exist and was merely a sexual object. The noise from the bar, the small space, the dirty sheets, and the bad smells she released didn't stop me from treating her like a piece of meat and enjoying her company. So when I had sex with Jessica over the next 3 weeks, she kept coming back to that mental picture. I closed my eyes, put my nose to her, and gave her the same kind of hug I had given that poor Mexican girl all those years ago, a biological one, nothing gentle or loving. It was almost too easy once I got going, to have her as hard and quickly as possible. My approach was pretty severe. Jessica noticed the differences, of course, and eventually brought them up. When we got into bed, she bemoaned the fact that she wished she could have had some tender, passionate sex. She seemed content with our arrangement, though, and thought, I'm a lover, which is a step up from the sex we had previously had in another life. I think she would have profited greatly from American visitors to Tijuana. Finding solid proof of an affair proved to be about as easy as I had anticipated. Mark used a portion of the funds for renovations, and multiple workers worked all day to finish repairs. About a month after Mark received the money, on a Monday morning, I accurately predicted that the electrician, who had $1,500 in his back pocket, would install a camera and recording device in one of the light fittings. In 2 days he'll have everything tidied up over the living room sofa. I thought I was prepared for what I would see on the webcam because I now had a decent idea of what Mark and Jessica were up to. I made the decision to watch everything objectively, like I would a movie, while enjoying a drink and some chips in my work office. It turns out, there's a lot more to witnessing your wife have sex with another man than just knowing it's happening. I was so drunk on scotch by the time the tape ended that I was unable to drive home. Twice my desk puked and threw a paperweight against my office door. Most of the details are as one might expect. I arrived early on Tuesday and started glancing around before I saw a woman wearing a blue dress enter the room carrying a big shopping bag. She opened the bag of fresh sheets and laid them out on the couch. I grimly confirmed that the woman was, in fact, Jessica as soon as I slowed down the recording to regular speed. She switched the sheets, then opened the bag once more to reveal a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. She took off her blue dress, folded it neatly, and stuffed it into her suitcase before she read a novel while waiting on the edge of the bed decked out in thigh-high stockings, French-cut underwear, and an extremely exposed bra. It was strangely bizarre, reminding me of an odd performance art show I saw in New York once, where a young woman dressed scantily read weird New Age poetry to an audience more interested in her breasts than the poetry. After a while, Mark came in. With a smile, Jessica put down her book and got up to give him a hug. Then, chastising him for keeping her waiting for his arrival, she pulled him back a little. He explained that her issue was that she was impatient for him to arrive. The old joke made them both laugh. After a few minutes of kissing, Jessica reached for his belt, undid his pants, and pulled them down around his ankles, revealing his underwear. The sexual activity I observed was not remarkable. They appeared to be going through this routine as they silently shifted, each anticipating what would come next. Sex was interesting. If I hadn't been upset, I would have found it boring that he had trouble keeping a steady rhythm, like a metronome. Mark reached his peak at 10 minutes in, and from the way Jessica quickly spread her legs and threw back her head, I thought she was reaching hers too. After lying there in silence for a short while, he turned to face his side, and they began kissing. By the time they were finished, I was furious and deeply hurt. I would never be able to forgive either of these 2 traitors because I knew that the images I had seen would remain permanently scarred on my consciousness. And I was happy to have a strategy to dissolve my marriage rather than keep it intact. As I moved forward to turn off the video, I realized they had begun conversing in bed. Jessica laid on her side with her head elevated, resting her right hand on her right elbow and drawing designs on Mark's chest. They exchanged glances, murmured softly, and smiled with satisfaction. Jessica discreetly complained about having to use the furniture business as a love nest. Mark turned on his side and responded, "Come on, Liv, if we use the hotel, we will undoubtedly leave marks. We almost got caught utilizing one of our houses. We really have no option." Jessica shrugged. "Yes, I understand, but I wish we had another area to play. I don't like this room. Changing last week's soiled sheets to make love does not excite me." Mark stretched out and stroked her face while smiling. "We could always run away together," Jessica chuckled in response, and Mark's demeanor became contemplative, his smile fading somewhat. "Seriously, Liv, have you ever regretted marrying John? I mean, I adore Mindy, and she's a good wife, but I'm wondering if you think it would be better if you and I married instead of them." Jessica sat up on the bed, practically sitting with her back against the sofa's back, her arms wrapped around her knees, which were drawn to her chest. She looked at Mark before responding. "Come on, Mark. How many times shall we do this?" "Well, we've got something pretty special, but no, I don't believe it would be better if we married. Of course, we'd be quite happy together, but I also love John, and you adore Mindy. If you and I were together, we would be alone. John is a highly monogamous person, and he would never seek a relationship with me if I was married. And I doubt Mindy would be pleased with that either." She leaned forward and kissed Mark's cheek, caressing his chest with her left hand. "The reality is, Mark, folks like you and me have a wonderful gift, love. We can love more than one person at once. We must love more than one person. This is perfect for us. But Mindy and John aren't like that. Their self-control inclinations ensure that they will never be able to do what you and I can. They will never be able to keep their emotions under control and make everyone pleased." Hearing this, my rage boiled over, and I sent my documents through the office door because I adored her. Perhaps she was the only lady who ever loved me. I had no idea how arrogant, delusional, and narcissistic my wife was. In her mind, she transformed her infidelities into some sort of virtue for herself. Obviously, this was not an act that was a stab in the back of her life or marriage, but rather one that enhanced the love in the world, which she not only had a right to, but also a moral obligation. I slept on the couch in my office that night and finished all of the paperwork. When I arrived home the following evening, Jessica welcomed me with her hands on her hips and a sour scowl. "Where the hell were you last night? I was quite worried. You didn't call, you didn't write, you didn't give me any idea. What the hell?" I stopped her with a raised hand. "Yesterday evening, I was at work. I got intoxicated and couldn't go home, so I stayed there." She looked at me in full confusion. "Wait, what? Are you drinking at work?" I smiled and nodded at her. She continued, "At the very least, you could tell me what is going on. I almost phoned the cops. And why in the heck were you drinking at work?" She was still looking at me, but her inquiry was utterly perplexing. Without saying anything, I moved past her into the living room, sat down on the sofa, placed my feet on the coffee table, took the briefcase in my lap, and opened it. Jessica let out an angry sigh as she followed me into the living room and sat down in a chair opposite the sofa. "How about some answers, John? HM? Why did you drink so much at work? What happened last night? What's happening?" I continued to rummage through my case, pulling out a few folders and placing them one by one on the couch next to me. "Just a second, Liv. I'd like to straighten things up a little." I looked at the documents a little more. I removed my legs from the table, replaced them with papers, and leaned forward, rubbing my hands together, expecting a delicious lunch. I grinned as I looked at Jessica. "Okay, then, let us get started." What? Let's begin." "Okay, well, after what happened last night, what about last night? What happened last night?" Jessica's confrontational demeanor soon gave way to something more docile. "When I came home, I started to feel a little scared." "Could you please tell me what you did last night?" "Yeah, I watched the video." "Did you watch the video?" "Yeah, I saw the film of you and Mark having sex on the couch in the lounge and found it upsetting, so perhaps I went a little overboard. Do you understand?" I smiled weakly, emotionless, looking at Jessica's expression, which ranged from surprise to shock to scared confusion. Her lips were partly open with tiny spasmodic movements that barely opened and closed, unable to make a single meaningful sound. Her eyes raced back and forth from the papers on the table to the door and to me, as if she expected someone or something to walk through the door, put the papers away, and everything would be well. Eventually, she spoke. I do not comprehend, John. What exactly are you talking about? Come on, Jessica. You cannot be that foolish. I'm referring to you and Mark and what you did yesterday and every other Tuesday for a year. I gestured at the papers in front of me. I am talking about the end of our marriage. Jessica gasped and briefly covered her mouth. I waited for her to respond. John, we can work it out. I guess I can help you understand. I believe I understand, love. I took a DVD from my briefcase, held it in my palms, and then pushed it over the table to her. Last night, I got a lot of information to assist me understand, indeed a veritable goldmine of new information about my adoring wife and pleasant brother-in-law. She stared at the DVD like it was a dangerous snake, recoiling slightly but making no attempt to hold it. Come on, Liv. This is your copy. I won't tell you how I acquired it, but I have mine for future reference to expand on your idea of love and dedication. She leaned forward and began to stand up, and for a second, it appeared like she was going to approach me, but I raised my hand to stop her. She sat down, beat her lips for a second, and then, gazing directly at me, she spoke slowly and methodically, with a fake confidence that I suspected was intended to conceal the quivering in her voice. John, please listen. You must open your mind and think about this. There is no use in destroying your life or our lives because our ideals and talents differ. I love you, and I've always been willing to accommodate our differences. I hope I interrupted her with a faux snort. Diverse ideals and talents? Seriously, do you believe cheating on your husband is a talent? Because honestly, Liv, I believe everyone is capable of this. Seriously, talent is not the appropriate word. She took a long breath, then looked up at the ceiling before returning her gaze to me. Ability. I believe the correct word is ability. I have a bigger capacity for laughter, and I can and have successfully loved more than one person at once. Aside from archaic ideals about love and relationships, there are no reasons why I cannot or should not use my skills. Please, just quit. You're only aggravating me with your excuses. I understand that you believe you have a special capacity that allows you to deceive, lie, and cheat when you should be faithful, but that's only lie's excuse. Anyone can have romantic relationships with numerous persons at the same time. This does not qualify them as lovers with exceptional ability, it simply makes them cheaters. Within the blink of an eye, be apologetic, conciliatory. Jessica was gone, replaced by an angry, aggressive, and overconfident vixen. Are you saying I'm a cheater? She attacked me. Okay, fair enough, it's most likely true from your perspective, but again, I never lost or stifled my love for you or Mark, so I never violated my emotions or compromised my feelings as a result of some archaic code that requires me to limit my relationship to one person and one person only. So while I may appear to be a cheater to you, I am perfectly content with what I see in the mirror. I have no doubts about what I did. None. She was breathing heavily and fiercely, her cheeks and chest were flushed, her eyes were full of fire, a gaze that made me challenge her, and I quit. Would you prefer to live like this, some kind of open relationship with a variety of guys, loving one guy one day then another the next? Yes, please. To each his own. But claiming you didn't cheat or were dishonest is complete because you never told me you had sex with Mark, and you know I wouldn't do it. She felt my fire and leaned aside slightly to avoid my gaze, but I twisted so that my gaze fell on hers, and then continued. So, you choose to lie by omission, the greatest omission of truth I have ever witnessed. You convinced me and almost everyone else that we were in a relationship, a pair who was completely committed to each other. But you went ahead and started or continued to keep Mark's inexpensive adventures in the furniture store hidden as best you could. You've told falsehoods and lived lies, regardless of the consequences. You have an unusual family philosophy that makes you a cheater." By this point, she had angry tears pouring down her cheeks, and her mouth was tightly clenched, more angry than sad, slowly shaking her head in disagreement with what I said, but seemingly unable to express her sentiments. I kept looking at her, hoping for an answer, but when nothing came, I ended the confrontation by pushing the papers closer to her. "Read it, find an attorney. This is correct." Eventually, she spoke. "What if I do not want a divorce?" "Then you're out of luck in life because you'll receive it." I stopped for a moment before adding with a barely hidden grin, "But that does not imply you will be alone." I moved out that evening into an apartment closer to work and rapidly returned to my old self. Jessica was a worker, a businessman, and a loner who did not have the time or willingness to participate in social events. My working hours were increasingly brutal. One person observed this, but I knew that if I sat at home, I would obsess over Jessica indefinitely, replaying her anxiety in my head, wondering if she was thinking about me or if she was having sex with Mark. I had no alternative except to work hard and try to forget about my marriage as soon as possible. My natural instinct in any form of competition is to do whatever it takes to win, and I suspect that most individuals who know me in business would anticipate lengthy, aggressive talks to reach an agreement. But it would have resulted in delays, interaction, and discomfort, and I was willing to pay to get out of the situation fast and cleanly. I offered Jessica a substantial lump amount in exchange for continuous assistance, threatening to remove the offer if she did not agree to a fast divorce. Deep down, I believe I wanted her to object so that I could insist on making the marriage work, to reject the proposal and fight for the marriage I wanted. Whatever chance I had of surviving, she believed her marriage had to be more important to her than money. It turns out that this was not true. With some half-serious arguments, she agreed to the requirements and my marriage ended within 60 days. Mark began to fall behind on payments a few months after the divorce was finalized. As one might expect, Bernie issued adequate cautions in an unpleasant letter, informing him that we would begin to take the money in any way he called and emailed with excuses and promises, almost pleading for more time to pay. I told Bernie to play hardball and made it plain that we would exercise our rights and seek bail as soon as legally possible. On the eve of the detention, Mark pleaded to meet with me in person, which I granted. At that point, I recognized he was desperate and willing to do anything, including taking money from anyone, to save himself from the wolves. I wanted the money to come from Jessica. I was looking forward to the meeting. We met at my office after work. Most of the secretaries had gone home, but Sherry, my personal assistant, stayed in the outer office, ready to produce papers if necessary. Mark was more nervous than I had ever seen him before, holding out his sweat-soaked hand for me to shake as he nervously went into my office. Jessica stood behind him, almost timidly, and seeing her made it difficult for me to catch my breath. Jessica sat closer to me than Mark. She wore one of my favorite dresses. She was completely made up and flashing her blazing smile, and I had no doubt that she had come to help Mark's chances by tapping into my ex's emotional connections. I instantly had an almost overwhelming want to rush to her, hold her in my arms, and kiss her. But seeing the risk to my sentiments, I furiously controlled this instinct, drawing a melancholy expression on my face and murmuring some sort of greeting and hesitant awareness of her existence. To be honest, I was astonished she came at all. I had been looking forward to this meeting for a long time and had carefully planned how it would go. I had not anticipated Jessica to be there, and I was concerned that her presence might interfere with my strategy to identify her with her lover's failings. I considered resisting, perhaps requesting that she wait outside, but eventually decided that her presence would make the outcome more pleasant. Mark began by attempting to turn me. After shaking my hand, he grinned as wide as he could and began making small talk about his desire to set things right. He wanted me to be happy and hoped I understood how much he valued me and how sad he was that things had turned out this way. I was surprised that he seemed to want to rekindle our friendship and thought we could be buddies again. I didn't buy that. Without smiling, I glanced at him and halted his little statement as dramatically as possible. "Mark, please stop this nonsense. Your apologies are meaningless to me. Okay, he swayed in his chair like if I'd struck him, then he pursed his lips, took a deep breath through his nostrils, and nodded in agreement before starting over. Okay, apologies, John, let us get down to business. He stared at me as if this was my meeting and that I should continue, but I merely extended my arms up in an expected posture, waiting for him to explain his case. He lowered his lips uncomfortably and ran a quivering hand through his hair before explaining that he had every intention of returning the money but was now short on funds. He mentioned how Bernie plays hardball and expressed uncertainty about how much he was pressuring him to pay. He went on to add that the business was on the verge of recovery and that with a little patience, he would be able to get his head above water. Finally, he tried to convince me that if I gave him more time, I would be in a better financial position. I leaned back in my chair, attentively scrutinizing Mark's tense smile, the thin film of sweat that had developed on his forehead as a result of the uncontrolled quivering of his right palm on the table between us. Mark, if you weren't a flagrant deceiver, I might consider granting you a respite. His eyes widened in surprise and distress, and he leaned forward to complain when he was stopped by a raised hand. Come on, Mark, you must understand that it is nearly impossible to trust a man who hasn't considered screwing his daughter-in-law. You should understand that asking the woman's spouse for financial assistance is completely ludicrous, Chris. Mark shuffled uneasily in his seat as Jessica hurriedly cleared his throat and spoke in a sorrowful tone. John, please, you can't penalize Mark simply because I can do whatever the hell I want. I snapped at Jessica, giving her a hostile look. Why are you here? I thought I might be able to persuade you to do it for old time's sake. I still worry about you, and I thought. I had interrupted her abruptly and rudely. You had an incorrect thought, honestly. Your presence reminds me of how Mark knew, both figuratively and physically. So, do yourself and Mark a favor by sitting back, trying to appear kind, and keeping comments to a minimum. Her eyes welled up with tears and her chin wrinkled, but she did as I said and sat back peacefully in her chair. I turned back to Mark. Okay, Mark, that's how things will be. You will pay the bill on time according to a schedule. I will begin the working off procedure to extract everything possible from the collateral. Mark shook his head forcefully. Come on, John. You cannot take my business from me. You cannot. I can and I will if you do not pay. Mark, my advice is to get money. Reach out to your family, locate a bank, or sell something. I do not care. Just collect the money. But, however, as you are aware, banks do not lend to me. Otherwise, I would have turned to them first when I couldn't help. They don't have that much money. I stared Mark directly in the eyes. Don't tell me that your family doesn't have money. I know they do. No, oh no. They would help if they could, but they simply cannot. How about her? I pointed a finger at Jessica. Have you asked her for money? Mark sat back down. Live is not the same as living. Live doesn't, I laughed. Of course, I did. I wrote her a check for $150,000. She has a lot of money. Jessica smirked at me, and Mark asked her a question implying that he was unaware of the lump sum payment. She felt apprehensive, maybe a bit nauseated. Yes, I have it, but I need the money. I laughed again. Stop, Liv. When you originally convinced me to support Mark, you told me how safe it was to give him money. Why are you hesitant now? Don't you believe Mark can get his business back on track? Don't you want to assist? Convince me that he's worth the money. If you believe this is a worthwhile investment for me, why not for you? I gave her an ugly grin. She gulped hard, briefly glanced at Mark, and then returned her gaze to me. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and said in a slightly defiant tone that she would make up the gap for a while. Mark grinned at her. She returned a feeble smile, and they walked away. Mark walked with confidence while Jessica walked with disappointment. As they held the door open for them, I left them with one final command. Remember, Mark, I don't care how. I only need money. He spit back at me. Jessica appeared worried. Over the following couple of months, I continued to seek refuge in my work, businesslike and inefficient with everyone. I proceeded to avoid intimate conversations at all costs, rejecting any social possibilities and preferring to work or be alone. I tried so hard not to think about my wife's infidelity, but everything reminded me of her. Of course, Mark's monthly check was laying on my desk. The check gave me a horrible sense of satisfaction, as if I had somehow helped to bring the perpetrators of my fortune into poverty. Mindy contacted me, and things got a little worse. She sent me multiple emails and even contacted me on the phone. I was astonished to find that Mark and Jessica had revealed to her, albeit in a mild version, their affair, and that she had taken it hard at first but had eventually forgiven them both. To my disappointment and terror, she faintly intimated that she suspected they were lovers and had reached an agreement in which Mark and Jessica continued to see each other. She even made a half-hearted effort to persuade me to consider getting Jessica back. My comments were caustic and cruel, and I was confident that by the end of the second call, I had left her in tears. Following that, I never heard from her again. Mindy's obvious tolerance made it clear that the emotional cost Mark and Jessica incurred was much lower than I had anticipated. Now, I was terrified that the story would end, that Mark would pay off his debt, that he would pay off Jessica, and that they would all be pleased with the outcome both financially and emotionally, and that they would leave me behind, shaking their heads at the poor soul who couldn't understand what modern love was. I should not have bothered. The furniture showroom burned down 9 months after I met Mark and Jessica. It was a stunning two-alarm fire that threatened numerous surrounding structures and made nightly headlines. I didn't see the storyline, but Bernie did, and he called me right away to discuss the consequences. He was unhappy with me for taking such a risk, since he was certain that the trust had flushed a huge sum of money down the toilet. I calmed him by offering to personally purchase the debt if he defaulted, assuring him that the property itself was valuable solely because of its position. Obvious doubts were raised about the fire, and when catalysts were discovered, the insurance company refused to pay. With no income from the store, Mark defaulted on the debt, and I bought the burning wreckage of the property, as well as 35 acres of Mississippi duck hunting territory. The criminal inquiry took nearly 6 months. The police put together a strong circumstantial case against Mark and Jessica. They were able to demonstrate that the store was losing money, and Jessica was spending more and more money each month to keep it open. Mark made repeated frantic attempts to acquire funds from other sources, all of which failed before secretly selling the business. But there were no purchasers, even at a significantly discounted price. Investigators discovered no proof that Jessica or Mark were present in the store on the night of the fire or that they purchased anything to start or precipitate it. However, their case was based on the assumption that they hired a professional to set the store on fire. They discovered multiple searches for the term arson on Jessica's personal computer, phone records indicating interactions with at least 2 males with arson convictions, and evidence that she had withdrawn $115,000 in cash the week before the fire. Jessica and Mark had a decent lawyer, who she most likely paid for with whatever money she had left, and the district attorney knew he was going to fight, so he began making agreements. I believe they began with first-degree arson and fraud charges and progressed from there. The defense refused to settle for anything less than fourth-degree arson, so a game of tag began to determine a trial date. On the first day of the trial, I was on the witness list, waiting outside in the lobby on a hard wooden bench. I was reading the newspaper and tapping my foot on the tile floor when a court official came out and stated that the trial had been canceled, that they had finally reached an agreement, and that we could all go home. I began packing my belongings to leave. Jessica and Mark entered from the hallway accompanied by many officers and their lawyer. Several reporters jumped up and pushed microphones under their noses, but they refused to comment. The reporters turned to their lawyer. Mark met with Mindy and exited the foyer with many officers, but Jessica looked my way and approached me to talk. I must admit that I appreciated her courage in confronting me under those circumstances. "So, John, is today your lucky day? Is this what you wanted? Will I be punished for my sins?" she inquired. I chuckled angrily and shook my head mockingly. I hope to have a faithful wife in a good marriage. I won't get what I want from you. Absent that, I only want my money, I responded. She snorted. So, you're not getting any of this now, are you? I got some of it back and now have a store, I replied. She laughed. And what will you do about it? Has it quit smoking yet? You'd be surprised what a savvy businessman can do with a decent piece of real estate, even a smoking one, I retorted. Her nostrils flared, and the interface toughened slightly. She took a big breath and then spoke again. And suddenly, you were happy alone, free of anyone tied to your employment for the foreseeable future, she offered me a knowing smirk. Do not deny it. I know you. I understand how much you dislike meeting new people. I'm working on it. Live. I loved you, but you're not the only lady in the world, I said. She smiled confidently. No, I'm not the only one, but I don't believe you can find what you businessmen call an equivalent successor. Whether you like it or not, you'll miss me. I leaned towards her and whispered in her ear, I might be a bit lonely, but you aren't. The good news is that you'll be sharing a small area with a group of attractive androgynous women with whom you can share all of your bountiful affection. This will benefit both you and the lesbian community, I added. Jessica astonished me by immediately losing her cool after my last statement, recoiling as if I were radioactive. Her expression was contemptuous, and her eyes were angry. She took a deep breath, her chest heaved fiercely many times, then she exploded. You're sanctimonious, self-centered, and emotionally damaged, she wailed as police hauled her away. I'm heading toward the door. You will be in the same hall as me, alone, with no one. Married to my slave, as I saw her shout at me, her love for me completely vanished, leaving only scornful loathing. I was struck by a sudden sense of sadness. I fought the temptation to express my grief, smiled faintly, and murmured some gags about her public usage of harsh language. But she just resumed her rant as if I hadn't said anything. But only a short time will pass until I am released from prison and able to resume my life, and you will remain alone, wishing to be with me. And then many years later, when you're married to a dull ex-secretary, you'll be sorry you didn't agree. The door closed behind her abruptly, silencing her ranting. I turned and left the courtroom. My day had been freed of judgment, and now with no meetings or conferences, I'm fighting with a developing sense of despair and loneliness. I visited the birth location and reflected on my life. The temperature fell, and the wind continued to whip my jacket and sting my face as I gazed around, still unsure what to do with the wreckage. I wasn't sure if I could even see the situation, and all I wanted to do was sell everything, forget about the loss, and get back to doing what I'd done before. It was safe, maybe even clever, but I knew there was another choice. You might take a risk and rebuild, possibly opening another furniture store. I was considering the potential of effectively selling furniture from the same location where Mark failed. I was considering making a huge issue out of it with plenty of advertising, billboards, and possibly even TV advertisements, something Mark and my ex couldn't miss. I can even call it Jessica and have plenty of last-minute sales. It seemed to me that the decisions I would make regarding the site were similar to the ones I had unknowingly made about my life in general. Jessica was correct about me. My natural and sole social position prior to meeting her was to retreat. Avoid the possibility of closeness, and concentrate on work. I saw myself gradually approaching a life of loneliness, a financially secure but largely unhappy existence. I reverted to doing something safe, such as sitting on the concrete block. I looked around again, still assessing my alternatives and planning my future. I was caught between my anxieties and desires, the ingrained behaviors that served and defined me, and my yearning to change and be unique. I was about to leave and return to work, letting things pass and deferring the decision until another day, when a few rays of late afternoon sun pierced through the clouds between the buildings and illuminated the graffiti-covered wall across the street. The light created a searing orange glow on the wall, giving the concrete and letters an incandescent appearance. The words were written in large white letters that were clear and easy to read: "Take action." I've always disliked superstitious people and how they let meaningless, objectively irrelevant things govern their life as indications or habits. But lying on a concrete slab in November, recalling these words seemed like fate, a communication from God. I got out my cell phone and contacted the workplace. I'm calling my helper. Hello, Sherry, what is the name of the architecture firm that created the new shopping complex that is making headlines, the one with glass and fountains? Is it Hammerstone or something like that? I believe she chuckled lightly to herself for a few moments as she checked. Yes, Hammerstone looks like they're based in Chicago. Okay, could you please arrange a meeting with me as soon as possible? Are we building anything? I gazed around the neighborhood, mentally envisioning the new store, and felt a burst of confidence. Yes, I think so. Okay, sure boss, anything else? As my gaze rested on the graffiti, I tightened my lip for a brief moment. On the opposite side of the roadway, again reading the imperative act. Yes, Sherry, there is one more thing. Do you remember the representative in the counterfeit jeans, Brenda White? She's a tall blonde, I believe. Sherry's tone became more skeptical, and I wondered if she felt I was having a breakdown. Could you give me her phone number? Of course, boss. Do you want me to connect it? No, I will call myself. Thank you. What are your thoughts on our story today? I think the novel is extremely engaging, with an intriguing premise and an unexpected twist at the conclusion. What is your opinion? Share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next video.